So, Mr. Conference Chairman, Professor Joseph Helden, dear esteemed conference delegates, dear guests, please allow me, first of all, to thank the International Academic Forum and the Conference Committee for giving me the honor to deliver this presentation that has been developed in terms of content and design exclusively for this international gathering and conference, which will also tackle our core theme of the conference today, which is international development and education, with particular reference to the marginalized youth and communities around the world who look up to us, who need our support more than ever before, and of course, who hopefully will get all that attention. To start with, let's see what these stories have in common. You might want to take some notes, and perhaps later on you can share some insights and see how we can connect the dots all the way to the end. These are real stories. Imagine you are a young refugee who has just arrived, let's say, in Europe, seeking safety after fleeing war and destruction. You carry the weight of your past with the hope of a better future. You dream of continuing your education, of studying, of one day, and perhaps being able to build back your nation. But reality hits you hard. You don't speak the language fluently. The tuition fees for tertiary education, higher education are just so expensive. No one to support you, no family that can back you up. The system is even more complex, and unfortunately, despite all your resilience, the doors remain closed. Now, let's look at a second case. Now, picture yourself, you are a young woman. You're bright, you're ambitious, you're full of potential. But one morning, the whole world changes. You wake up to find a degree, or unfortunately, you are forced into circumstances that said that you can no longer attend university. So your right to education has been erased overnight. Your classroom is now a memory. You're disconnected with your classmates. Your dream of becoming a doctor, an engineer, a teacher are stolen by the forces beyond your control or beyond the circumstances that you were familiar with. Let's see case number 3. You're a student, you're a teacher, you're a professor, and all of a sudden, all the higher education institutions in your country and your zone are bombed or destructed. We're speaking, for example, if we reflect on just an example, there's 19 higher education institutions. We're speaking about more than 625,000 young people with their ambitions, further education dreams, and another 222,500 teachers left without jobs. Certainty, your books, your research, your future are all turned to rubble. And education is no longer an option, it's simply a fight for survival. So what do these 3 cases have in common? Unfortunately, all these stories reveal the dark reality that education, higher education, is not accessible to everyone, varying in different degrees, not because of a lack of talent or ambitions or even dedication. It's simply because, of course, war, displacement, conflict, economic hardships, or even exclusion. So what does that mean if we look at it from a global context? Well, unfortunately, the world is witnessing over 56 conflicts today. That is the highest since World War II. More than 92 countries are involved outside of their borders. Now, how does that affect education? And how does war, unfortunately, complicate the situation? Well, every 3 hours, there's an attack on education. And the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attacks defines attack on education as any intentional threat or use of force against students, educators, or facilities, education facilities. So that's about 8 attacks per day. If that is the case, then of course the consequences are dramatic, because over 1 out of 6 globally children live in zones affected by conflict. And that affects the transgenerational consequences, because when we have children who are not educated or complete school, obviously it leads to the snowball effect. So transgenerates from family to family to family. And that is quite, dramatic in the short, mid, and long-term consequences. Now, what is also quite significant is that according to UNICEF, about 1/3 of those children live in poor countries or low economic countries, which adds even more to the burden itself. And those people are 2 times more likely to drop out of school later on, which of course will also have a consequence that we're going to see in a few seconds. So how do we look at this from a different perspective? Well, these kids, of course, in conflict zones face not only just war, but exclusion. And they're excluded from education itself, from the opportunity to grow, to contribute to the society, and of course, to a sense of belonging, especially when they are displaced. Who are the vulnerable youth that we're referring to? Well, we might want to divide them into 2 categories to simplify, of course, the understanding. And there are those perhaps that are affected by what we call conflicts. And conflicts simply means that, of course, people are going to be displaced, what we call forcibly displaced individuals, populations. There are migrations, but there are also refugees. And there are those who are also hit, unfortunately, by natural disasters and human catastrophes. So what implication does this have? Well, it simply has an impact on education itself. Why? Because war does affect education directly. There is destruction, and destruction also occurs on the facilities, on universities, on schools. But that also means, of course, that governments will take away budgets, financial allocations from education to what we call military warfare, which becomes a priority, which means that education is no more the focal point. And if that is the case, then that simply means, obviously, that we're going to have no more funding for teachers, educators. Those educators, hundreds of thousands, are going to leave the industry. They're going to leave the profession. And it's even more difficult to bring them back because they're going to have to find other resources for survival. And when you ask them, once things are back, go back to teach, he says, well, sorry, I already moved on. So there's going to be a teacher's gap, first of all. Second, of course, we're going to have students who are going to drop out. And we're going to have also, of course, low attendance, which builds up on this even more dramatically. So education is directly affected by conflict. And it's quite alarming that 71% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries. So can you imagine the 71% of the 43 million refugees where they are now? They're already in a zone. They come from a zone that is weak, poor, and they go to an even more burden in a neighboring country, which we're going to see in a minute. Now, only 7% of the refugees have access to higher education, 7%. And that is, of course, far from the 15% by 2030 target set by the United Nations Refugee Agency. So that means that there's a lot much work that we need to do so that we can, of course, enable people to have access to tertiary education and to help them move on. When it comes to marginalized youth, here, of course, we might also want to consider social, economic, and demographic factors based on a number of course, categories. And what is interesting here is that funding not only supports them, but it also empowers them. But we also have to look at it from a different perspective, because let's imagine a more complicated scenario. You are in Lebanon, a beautiful country, Lebanon. You're not a refugee in Lebanon. It's your home country. You're a local student. Even then, education is a luxury. And political instability, economic collapses, crumbling infrastructure makes higher education even more difficult to attain. Universities are struggling with budgets and, of course, to stay open. And even those who are academically gifted, they don't necessarily find a job, a rewarding job, based on their degrees. But then comes another complexity where, due to a conflict in a neighboring country, let's say Syria, you've got millions of people who go to the neighboring country, Lebanon. So now we have a complexity. How would the Lebanese feel? Would they feel that they are discriminated based on the fact that they're in their home country and they have outsiders coming in and receiving financial aid for education and competing with them? So how would we build that social cohesion between an affected country, population, and those who are our target beneficiaries? And we're going to come to this in a minute, because refugees normally stay in protracted areas, zones from 5 to 17 years, 5 to 17 years, and they are on the move from one country to another, whether internally displaced or simply crossing borders on foot. And that's how we want to ask a simple question. If 69% of refugees are hosted by neighboring countries, then of course that would lay more burden on the economy and demographics of that host countries. So can education be a victim of conflict, but also a driver of peace? How can we transform these complexities? How can we make this a challenge for us so that we can move on forward and help those in need? Well, let's look at the bigger picture. Look at the bigger picture. The good news is here, the hope is that the global number of students pursuing tertiary education, higher education, has more than doubled in the last 2 decades. More than doubled in the last 2 decades. That's very encouraging news. We're speaking about 222 million students enrolled in tertiary education globally, up from only 100 million in 2000. In Latin America and the Caribbean, for those who are from that region, the number of students have increased since 2000. In sub-Saharan Africa, we've also have enrollment that have doubled every 20 years. However, while the numbers have increased, there are still concerns about the quality of tertiary education. And if we look at this small graph, we'll see that there are zones in the world that lack still the full support for access to tertiary education. We're speaking about the Middle East, we're speaking about North Africa, we're speaking about Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And we'll see that in the last 4 zones, it is below the average of 44% globally in those areas. Now, what would be the limitations for that access, or for universal access to tertiary education? There are 2 types. There is the limitation itself, based on either poverty, crisis and emergencies, high tuition fees, entrance examinations, which are complex or too difficult, geographical mobility from one place to another, rural areas, remote areas, and even discrimination, whether in the application or perhaps in the post-graduation for the employment, which of course, which hinders access to the university or disencourages students. But also you have infrastructure hinders. Insufficient number of teachers who leave the industry or the profession, teachers leaving it, insufficient facilities, electricity, internet, computer access, low budgets, and low aspirations. And all that, of course, requires us to take into consideration that education is so essential that, of course, we need to empower these people to have access to it if we want to create an understanding of what peace and education is all about. So, as Professor Halden said, when we look at global citizen education for peace and leaving no one behind, what are the barriers that we need to break to provide opportunities for meaningful inclusion? What are the barriers, and how can we work together to foster collaboration and joint work together so that we can make the education accessible, especially with tertiary education? Well, I'm pleased to share with you this infographic, which is an accumulation of all the problems and barriers that a normal, vulnerable, or marginalized or refugee would face when it comes to education opportunities and inclusion. And if I just want to highlight 3 or 4 things, we've got on the right the forcibly displaced and conflict-affected individuals with all the complexities and problems that they have. On the left side, we've got marginalized youth, and then we've got the interconnecting vulnerabilities. If we just take one or two examples, if we look at financial barriers by themselves, here we've got the tuition costs, we've got economic instability, and we've got even perhaps no access to funding. If we look at psychological barriers, trauma, social isolation, you even have the imposter syndrome. If you look at systemic barriers, you've got legal status issues, statelessness, refugee restrictions, unrecognized prior education, exclusion policies, and the like, and so on. The host versus home community animosity. I spoke about the Syrians going to Lebanon. We wanted to support the Syrians with scholarships in Lebanon. We realized that we were giving them so much attention that the Lebanese were disappointed and saying, look, these are outsiders. They're coming to our country. They get support. What about us, the Lebanese? So we had to open up our scholarship programs for the Lebanese so that we would create some kind of a social cohesion between both. And that was one way of creatively trying to resolve it. Freedom of movement and also instability. We wanted to also, once again, to the Syrians, we wanted to help more than 1,000 displaced refugees and people in Syria who were either in what we call protected areas or in neighboring countries. And we realized that a 4-year degree was just too much of a commitment because of instability, political, but also in terms of mobility. And so we went from a 4-year degree to a 2-year certificate program. And we focused on green skills where now, of course, they can go back and work. So once again, these are some ideas that we had where we tried to resolve the problems and complexities. But how would we break these barriers? How can we break these barriers? How can we open doors? How can we transform all these barriers into opportunities with creativity and with solutions, with insights? Well, I think if we want to look at these barriers where we need to unblock so that, of course, we can empower them to be contributors to peace and progress, we might want to look at it from 3 different perspectives. The holistic approach, as we call it, covering a major issue, which of course is the high tuition fees, the cost, which is growing more than ever before, take into consideration the global economic environment. We've got how can we end isolation and exclusion for these affected people? And how can we overcome the statelessness and legal, of course, hurdle that they face? We'll come very briefly to each one of them. When it comes to innovative financing and making dreams come true, without financing, of course, innovative financing, these dreams cannot come true. They'll never come true. We need financing. Financing is the blood. It's everywhere. It's everything. Every business needs it, but every cycle in the world perhaps needs some kind of resource of funding. What happens, in fact, is that what we are facing is that low and lower middle income countries are facing, unfortunately, an annual gap of about $100 billion a year for education. Now it's becoming even more dramatic as we see that governments are also, unfortunately, cutting budgets for education based on budget constraints, or whether for internal politics or simply for national interest priorities. And if that is the case, then of course, unfortunately for us, tertiary education, and I quote, is the hardest hit. It is the first cut and the lowest prioritized when it comes to national interest and investment. And that is quite dramatic because if education is expensive, please remember that exclusion is costlier. Education is expensive, perhaps, but exclusion is costlier. And according to the most recent figures that we have from UNESCO, staggering $1.1 trillion could be lost annually by governments by simply having students drop out of school at an early age. And of course, that's $3.3 billion for children simply for lacking the skill that they need as they move on in their lives. So yes, we need to invest. Otherwise, we're going to have to be trying to catch up as much as we can. So when it comes to innovative financing, and making dreams come a reality, there is hope, fortunately for us. And that can change a lot. By investing in scholarships, safe learning spaces, but also in international collaboration, and these forums are an excellent avenues for this, we can open doors where walls have been built. The question is not whether we can afford to invest, but whether if we can afford not to invest. This innovative financing infograph shows you the different channels and models of innovative financing that perhaps we might want to consider today more than ever before. And here, with some of the sources that I might already have, I'd like to focus on one in particular, is what we call the 3 Ps, the private public partnerships, which are quite more than ever before on the rise and quite creative. The second thing that I'd like to highlight also is that the non-state actors are more and more contributing to education and to funding education than ever before, which is also a very positive sign as well. And education diplomacy, as we call it, education diplomacy also, scholarship aid, for example, from the Non-Organization of Economic and Cooperation and Development, DAC, Developing Assistant Countries, rose from 1% in 2014 to 9% in 2022, with major contributions from 4 countries in particular: Romania, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And so there are positive signs. But if you look at this beautifully, you've got universities, research centers, you've got governments, what we call international development agencies, you've got individuals, alumni, you've got also the private-public partnerships, but also the foundations. I'd like to show a concrete example of how this works in real practice. If you remember, when the Afghan crisis unfolded, we were receiving calls nonstop from universities, foundations, international NGOs, and governments. They were all asking the same question: what can we do to help the Afghan refugees? And while the outpouring of support was so incredible and so encouraging, we just quickly realized that, without coordination and joint efforts, everything would be fragmented. And unfortunately, that would lead to duplication and, of course, inefficiencies. So we recognized this and we took immediate action. And one of the ways that we did was we brought in universities all together. We brought in government support. We brought in foundations and other key shareholders to develop a unified strategic response. Within 2 months, we were able to clear house to streamline our efforts, ensuring that all the resources were allocated. Through collaboration, we secured P1 visas to the United States, and we were able to relocate 250 young Afghans to the United States, working with the government institutions and partners, demonstrating how and what can be done to support refugees, not just with words, but with swift action. So what happened was that we were able, through innovative financing, to make real transformation through this program that we call the QSAP, the Qatar Scholarship for Afghan Program. So Qatar Fund for Development, which is an ODA, we brought in financial support, and we needed co-financing, because we could have done it alone. But we believe in international partnerships, fostering collaboration. And so we brought in the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, who also reached out to Afghan Future Fund for co-funding. And through the IIE, Institute of International Education, we were able to partner with 55 universities in the United States to host those 250 students. This shows a perfect example of what PPP is all about: private-public partnerships and real action. The success story, the impact itself, is that we surveyed them, and for those who graduated just a few months ago, 91% of them were able to find a job within 6 months of their graduation in the field that they studied, creating a real impact, but also success stories. And that was a reflection, of course, of the advantage of innovative financing models, where, of course, we found ways to diversify our funding, reduce financial aid, burden, make it less on each one, benefit economies of scale, lead more resources, better risk mitigation, but also foster collaboration and shared responsibility, which was very important for us because we could do it alone, but doing it together is much more meaningful and purposeful and impactful. And of course, it allowed education to become more impactful and sustainable. So how do we build then, how do we move on with ending isolation and exclusion? Well, of course, there has to be a sense of community building for these people. They're stateless, they feel isolated, they feel weak, they are vulnerable. So what do we do and how can we support this? Well, beyond financing, the power of nations working together can be quite impactful because financial aid is not enough by itself. Real impact comes from investing in people, not just programs. And that's why scholars, students, beneficiaries, they feel valued. Mentorship, networking, emotional support, psychological support is very important. And that is how we were able to connect them together. For example, with 10,500 beneficiaries in over 10 countries, over 60 universities, one of the biggest challenges was how can we get them together so that they feel that they are together, united? There's a sense of community and engagement. And obviously here, we were embracing global citizen and engagement and action simply through, of course, what we call the Qatar Connection. Qatar Connection, which we developed, was simply connecting. It's a component of our scholarship program where we were able to connect our beneficiaries and alumni to one another and to Qatar through the internship exchange programs and activities. And that's how, of course, we brought in mentorship programs and development. The idea behind this is that they felt that there was a sense of community, and that was what made them valued as well. Creating an ecosystem where young people feel seen, valued, and connected is not always easy for those people, but that's what they need. They need attention. They need care. They need people to stand with them and to support them. And what is quite remarkable here is that when it comes to higher education, and scholarships in fragile context, of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. While scholarships are a common way to, of course, to reduce and overcome financial aid and burdens, remember that each scholarship must be also tailored to its specific context. And that would require key factors such as in the program design, including demographics of beneficiaries, their country of origin, taking into consideration the conditions of their host and new countries, but also their long-term aspirations. And that's how, of course, other factors would be taken into consideration. That's why whenever we design programs, obviously, we take into consideration what we call the evaluation criteria on how relevant the program is, how coherent it is to the objectives, to the targets, how effective and efficient they are, but also what is the likely impact that it's going to generate along with the sustainability and the scalability later on. And that is, of course, a very important consideration that we have or that we take into consideration when it comes to our partnerships, along with our United Nations agencies that we have partnered with. So over 60, 65 universities where we try to build international cooperation through education and, of course, to foster that as well. Coming towards the end, how does this reflect also in concrete examples? Well, we've got a lot of stories of resilience and, of course, ambition and success. And I'm sure that our next speaker is going to be speaking about resilience as well. But when it comes to student resilience, it's quite important because how can we create an impact? How can we generate success stories? I'll give you a very, very short, brief example. This man, Amarjat Singh Gaba, a very interesting case, born in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. He moves to Russia, then to India, and at the age of 17 in the UK, 4 countries at the age of 17. Unstable, uncertain, and of course, needs a direction. So he applies to a university, Oxford, one of our partner universities, and EAA steps in to support him. Today, Jalalabad, Amarjit, of course, he not only graduated with a master's degree, but he is now also working one of the top companies, corporations in a very, very beautiful, decent profession. And even more, he's giving back to the society, to the community. He not only received aid, but he's trying to give back through, of course, community service. And that is how he generates impact. Successful generation of impact. Concrete, tangible. How? By contributing to the economic growth. He is now simply, thanks to quality and relevant education, he contributes to the stimulation of the economy. And at higher education levels correlate with greater, of course, benefits and earnings. But he also contributes to the private and non-private sector. And if he wants to go to entrepreneurship, that's even more encouraging, where, of course, he contributes with innovation and insights and his input and contribute to the national economy at large. But he also contributes with impact to the community service and civic engagement by giving back. Studies show that scholarship students are more likely to give back because they felt what it meant to be supported, so they want to give back. And giving back, of course, is in his blood, but it's also a way of supporting others as well. And finally, of course, on his self-well-being. And very interestingly here is that higher education levels mainly correlate with greater earnings as scholarships contribute to the development of the human capital, and they end what we call the cycle of poverty, which is the main objective: zero hunger, zero poverty as well. A very interesting study showed that each year of schooling boosts an hourly earnings by 9%. And tertiary education, that rate is 17%. And by doing so, of course, we see that the sustainable goals are achieved as we come to the end of the impact. And of course, that's how the cycle moves on. Finally, we're very pleased with the impact story that is Inspire, where, of course, these are not just individual successes, but there are also stories of global change. At Al Fakhura, we try to empower people, marginalized youth, conflict-affected communities with opportunities to continue their higher education as much as we can, with the partner universities that we have around the world as well, and with the, of course, what we call the retention rates, which are very high. The takeaways from today's presentation is simply how is education a path to global citizenship and peace? Well, education is not just about degrees, it's about building peace and social cohesion. Without innovative financing, these dreams remain out of reach. We need innovative financing and human-centered engagement. If that is the case, we hereby urge governments, institutions, and funders to go beyond aid and invest in real change. When nations work together, remember, we walk the talk of true global citizenship. And with that, of course, join us in stepping up and, of course, in supporting the next generation of global citizens at large. Ladies and gentlemen, today, more than ever before, I'm very proud and humbled to be celebrating with you on this very day, 1 year of my engagement with the Education Above All Foundation in Qatar. I feel the honor and privilege and responsibility of advocating and supporting, of course, the noble cause of equitable and quality education for those who need us the most. At the Education Above Foundation, which was founded in 2012 in Qatar, we aim to contribute to the human, social, and economic development of societies through the provision, as you can see, of course, quality education for all. We focus on the marginalized children, youth, women, and those who are affected by conflicts and national disasters so that they can become active contributors to their community and societies. We're proud to be engaged in more than 120 projects in more than 67 countries and with 70 partners worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your support. And of course, I remain available for any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dhia. We have about 6 or 7 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, there's one straight quickly there.
Hello, everyone. I am Surya from Indonesia. So I'll give you a little bit backgrounds in developing countries specific to my home country. Tertiary education is mostly expensive. Students paid more for the tuition fee. However, when they graduated, they earn less than what they have to pay in the tertiary education. And also there are cases like they got supported by the scholarship. Okay, they got supported by the scholarship, however, they have to contribute. So how do we make that tertiary education is still worthwhile investment for their personally, and also they could contribute for their home country, for the developing countries specifically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take all the questions and then perhaps answer them together or one by one. Thank you very much. So, of course, thank you very much. Yes, perhaps we would need to focus on what we call quality and relevant education, tertiary education, where, of course, the education would lead to what we call market-driven jobs and employability. And, of course, there are a lot of studies, reviews, but it's also based on the national economies and, of course, on the local needs and communities. One, of course, is the green sector, the green skills as well, of course, for example, in your country, in the region, which is on the rise and so on. So yes, we would need to focus on this. That's the role also of higher education institutions to innovate their programs, but also the government to oversee that the programs are quite relevant and aligned with the needs of the country at large.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. My name is Dinara. I'm from Kazakhstan. So I'm researching right now return migration to Kazakhstan. So return migration from ethnic Kazakh groups from Mongolia and China back to Kazakhstan. And these groups are considered marginalized. And one of the things that the Kazakhstani government is doing is providing them tertiary education, higher education scholarship, which is funded with a stipend and everything. My question is a question about Lebanon from your example, right? How to preserve this stability when the local youth considers that they are, the migrant youth are unfairly kind of supported at the expense of their own future? So what would be your advice for the low middle income countries who want to support marginalized youth, but not at the expense of locals?
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course, once again, we focused on what we call social inclusion, and that's where we had to try to balance so that there's no discrimination and there's no hostility between the both communities. And that was some kind of an art that we had to develop where we would have to balance that. Maybe the percentage may not be 50-50, but at least it was a sign that we showed that we care and that, of course, that they also received attention as well. So social inclusion was important, mixing and diversifying and giving opportunities for others as well, so they are not singled out. Thank you. Please.
Hello, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Mary Jean Sadali, and I'm the Dean of Education at University of New Brunswick in Canada. One of the connections I made with your talk was to a concept of peace literacies, which is very important in relation to some of the work of EDI, some of the work in social justice that's happening in Canada in education. And the founder of that is a man by the name of Paul Chappell. And he speaks about the importance of inclusion of peace literacies at all levels of education, right from kindergarten through university. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Of course, education is a catalyst for peace. And of course, we should educate people on peace from day one. Peace is education. Education is, of course, friendship. It's cohesion, social cohesion, international cohesion, intercultural, internationalization in every sense of the word. So if we enroot the sense, or if we build a mindset that education is peace, then of course we can have peace builders all around the world, rooted everywhere, and of course contributing for everlasting peace. So very nice. Thank you for the insight.
Hi, I'm Hock Lin from Singapore.
Yes.
So although I study aging, but I'm interested in education too. So I just want to ask, because I have some engagement with the Miamis in my volunteer work, and they're in conflict. So number one is actually this whole perspective of peace education in the context of the people who are in conflict, because they're getting out of that mindset is one big challenge before they can move to academic education. And the number two is about, I like your part about financing as well as the human-centered engagement. My question is about your thoughts about remodeling education, the relevancy of academic education to this group of people. Or would vocational education be a higher priority because work comes first? Thanks.
Of course, relevant education is very important because you also have to take into consideration the context itself, the home and the host country, but also the instability that these people may face. So the turnaround has to be perhaps a little bit quick. As I said, instead of a 4-year degree, you might want to focus on a certificate or a professional, an associate degree that would help them to move on quicker and be able to stand on their feet and cut the cycle of poverty, but also get them more included into the society. And that is very important. That's where creativity is all about. That's where customization is all about. And that's where no one size fits all would work out.